I feel like every time I have one of these clinics or work with people in the community, I feel like I become a more humble coach. I realize I don't know everything. And when you can link up with people in the environment and people in the community, then a great benefit is that you automatically know what they know. So I really appreciate the opportunity to listen to Chris. This next hour, we're going to be with Shira Lewis. She's a PT and DPT from Precision Choreography, and she's going to talk about a physical therapist perspective on coaching. So, in the beginning of the pandemic, we had to start to learn how do we incorporate so much gymnastics in such a small area, and how do I make it so that I can keep these kids socially distant and still learn and still be able to supervise. And I imagine you have kids in, six by six by six squares all along the floor, and because you can't move through the gym, I'm stuck on floor for an hour. I need to be able to work on handstands and open shoulder angles, and I need to address things like wrist flexibility. The things that in the gym that I notice are a big issue are wrist flexibility, overhead range of motion. Hold on, I'm just getting somebody else in. Overhead range of motion, lat flexibility, ankle strength, ankle flexibility, hyperpronation. How do we address all of those things so that not only can we have good gymnasts, but we can have good and healthy athletes? So then I decide maybe we should go to my good friend Shira Lewis because she's great at talking about those things. So Shira, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I am really excited. So I am a physical therapist and I've worn many hats in the gymnastics world, and I'm excited to share some of the science that excites me and assists in my decision making. So some things, as a coach, we are constantly implementing tools to assess and adjust our plan. And in physical therapy, we utilize science and research. We call this evidence-based practice. Awesome part is that gymnastics is starting to do this as well. So we'll look at the scientific influence of both physical properties and learning principles when teaching gymnastics. First, efficiency is achieving maximum productivity with minimum wasted effort. So what are we trying to be efficient with? Obviously teaching a skill, but more importantly, I think that the efficiency in the motor learning is most important. So that's all of the processes involved in practicing a task, which creates permanent change in our ability to perform that task. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we keep going. But first, we can look at what are the physical demands of the skill. So to be more efficient teachers, we need to constantly break down and evaluate what we're seeing and then compare it to the desired action that we want, as well as considering the current learning phase. So when we're evaluating movement, there's a bunch of different ways we can do it. This is a method that comes from the Gray Institute program called Certification in Applied Functional Science. And it breaks down how to evaluate movement for improved function and performance. I really like it because there's a big emphasis on individuals' goals and needs. So I've adapted it a little for the gymnastics context, and we'll go through that. First, we have to gather the information. So you want to think about what's the goal, which was usually to get a skill. Where are they currently? Do they have any movements or previous skills they've learned that will help in learning this? You're just evaluating where in the process are you and where are you starting your teaching. So then you're going to look at the actions needed. This could be the difference, especially for men, the different types of taps that you might need, or the action of takeoff for a double tuck versus a double layout. Any of those, you want to really evaluate what is the action that you need. And then you can look at it in terms of fundamental movement patterns. Typically, this would be lunging, squatting, pushing, pulling. But in gymnastics, I would consider these our basics and our shapes. So hollow, handstand, arch, tuck, pike, any of those. From there, we can look at local implications. So like we talked about just before, the tight shoulders or ankles, if they have shorter arms or longer arms, proprioception, all of those pieces. And then we can design the assessment and this action. So if it requires opening the shoulders and kicking the heels down, we want to create movements and test movements that do each of those pieces. So often the assessment of those functional movements become the exercises. The first thing I typically do is look at local areas, because if they don't have the mobility, stability, and strength required for the action, they're not going to be able to do it, especially with the appropriate timing and coordination that is needed. After that, we can design a movement to assess the sequence, or a sequence of movements to assess the quality of the desired. Is this working? Not really. So here, I'm training the tension of the body, the proper position in a hurdle, the direction of the arms, and really we're working the acceleration that you want as they run and hurdle and continue their pass. So as we just saw, the assessment where I'm looking at his ability to complete it then becomes the exercise. Where he was holding, he's able to do it. So now I have him moving 3 times really quickly, or maybe more than that, in order to get the action I'm looking for. So the CAFS program uses these 10 principles as a framework for creating assessments. What part of the action can they do successfully? Then you want to begin to challenge the edges of the limitations and continue adapting the movement by changing one or more of the variables. So thinking about this hurdle, again, just see if you can see it. So the action he's doing here is lunging, lifting his arms. He's on the gym floor, so he's not on an unstable surface, though we can always adapt that later. His arms are the driver. That's what's moving him forward. And he has a very clear goal of reaching forward and at that specific height. We're using the light banded resistance to stress this action. And then we have him do fast, repetitive motions to replicate the actual speed and cause muscle fatigue. We can further adapt this by putting him on an unstable surface, which is going to work both his ankle and lower extremity stability, as well as his core. And then we can progress even further to make the arms and the foot a driver. So maybe he's standing upright and he does the hop or the step and the lunge all together. That'll make it a lot harder, especially with that feedback of the band. There are so many other considerations, and you might be thinking, how do we fit this all in? And my answer is twofold to that. I'm not here, well, you might take some specific exercises. I'm not here to give you more exercises. This is a way to systematically evaluate the current drills and exercises you're using to see if they're meeting your goals. So it's an easy method to adapt your plans and think outside the box when it's necessary. We should just remember that we are looking to improve movement efficiency and learning. So if you think that you still don't have time, not all of these exercises, every strength, every range of motion, every stability exercise, they don't need to be done all the time by every person. So looking at a study testing the effects of in-season maintenance with differences in frequency. So there was a strength training performed 2 times a week for 10 weeks. This was in preseason. They did all kinds of strength for jump height, sprinting, and output of their lower extremities. After the 10 weeks of 2 times a week, they then moved into their in-season training where they only performed these exercises once a week for the 12 weeks of in the season. and they found that there was no statistical difference in any of the parameters. So they were able to maintain their strength with only 1 time a week. They found that when they moved to every other week is when they started to see a decrease. So 1 time a week can be enough to maintain our strength gains if we properly utilize our preseason training. So now let's look at the handstand as a foundational movement like we've talked about. We have walking and squatting and pushing and pulling, but in gymnastics, handstand really is such a foundation. And we have to train it extensively before we can consider it one of these automatic foundational patterns. So how do we look at it using this method? First, the goal would be to achieve and maintain a proper shape. And we might see that arch or that they can't balance, which we now know how to do. Thank you, Chris. They might have closed shoulders or any other thing that you typically see in a handstand. So what actions are needed to complete a handstand? We have shoulder head mobility, or overhead shoulder mobility, opposing forces of the ribs and hips. So we're trying to pull the ribs in and we're trying to open the hips at the same time rather than that C rounded shape or opposite in the arch. Then we have the movements. What foundational patterns are there? So lifting the arms, pushing off the ground, opening the hips. Those are movements that we know and are automatic. So we can look at local areas, the mobility in the shoulders and the thoracic spine, the mobility and stability of the wrists, and then potentially even their ability to open their hips. So when we design a movement sequence, we can use any number of those awesome shaping and holding drills we just reviewed, and then consider principles to challenge this position. What plane of motion are you in? Or plane of motion are you holding? What direction? Do you have a driver that's moving something? How can you make it more challenging without changing the underlying movement? So local implications would be overhead mobility. These are just some of my favorite things to do for overhead mobility. We have standard foam rolling. Here you can see an overhead lift, and we're just working the ribs down. He was having trouble keeping his ribs down even in this position, but eventually he would move further and further away from the wall, moving up onto an elevated block and being able to hold with weight on this bar. I don't have any weight on this bar because he was just on the ground. This overhead reach, rollouts on a foam roller. So he was going in and out. One of the best stretches for the lats. And then I did add the wrist because it's always important when we're on there. Here you can see he's using the band to give a little bit of force in the opposite direction, which allows for greater range of motion and helps in our mobility work. So the big thing is when you're looking at the shoulders, it's often not the shoulders. Don't forget the thoracic spine. In this video, he has a lot of trouble and doesn't have much range of motion in the thoracic spine. I would really like to see a little bit more rounding as he comes down and opening the chest as he lifts up. Here's another version of working on the thoracic spine. Are these videos coming through okay? Cool, awesome. Those are just a few of my favorite mobility exercises. So then we have stability overhead. Here he's working, pressing into that foam roller. You can also add a band around for that one to really give a little more external rotation force and take out some of the muscles involved. Here, just working on shape.
Shira, can you explain what you mean about the band around? You mean a band around the wrists pulling like?
Oh, so if you have one of those loop bands, like a light green or whatever color it is, you can put it around your forearms while you're doing that. So you're pulling out against the band while you're sliding up and down. It just changes some of the rotator cuff muscle involvement by adding that action. So you're really working both the serratus and pushing into the wall, which is like that push muscle, and then lifting through that upper range of motion where you want to be in a handstand. Angels are, you know, some of the most common shoulder stability exercises. You can do them against the wall, you can do them in prone, really anywhere, just do them. What else do we have on here for stability? Here you can see she's hypermobile, and I know in men's we have fewer hypermobile, but they do exist. And she's really struggling to find a handstand line because that hoop gives so much input away from the body, just without weight, just the weight of that hula hoop. She was having trouble finding her line, so find it in any position possible. Here, again, he's focusing on holding the position, and now we've added a weighted ball to work on our forearm strength. Just holding one arm and then you do the other. And then a kettlebell is great because it gives its own feedback, especially when you hold the handle. It's wobbling and giving you more challenge. You can also add perturbations from an external source like you have here. So here he's working his shoulders and his line, and then his core is definitely getting big engagement. And then strength, there are any number of drills we all do as coaches for shoulder strength. Here's just a couple: wall walks, shoulder taps. And then you can see he's doing shrugs, and he's using that feedback of the wall to know that his arms are in the correct position overhead. His head position could change a bit to be more upright instead of looking down at the ground. But really we're looking here that he's holding his ribs in, his hips are open, his shoulders are back, and he is doing shoulder shrugs with that weighted ball. So then we can put it into an action. I love taking out the idea of the balance. Since we have separate balance things, how do we really work the shape with the movement? So we just have a weighted ball. It could be more weighted than that. That's just all we had. Practice on just the pushing aspect. Just a couple drills we've got.
Can you show those drills one more time through?
Yeah.
Those were awesome.
So here, I typically use a bar actually, and it can be used for two different purposes. So for someone who's tight, that bar helps get them into position with a little bit of weight on it. For someone who is a little more hypermobile, like this gymnast, he's focusing similarly to that hula hoop stability, except now I'm adding a higher amount of weight and resistance. Here, just taking out all the other factors. So she's just working that upper body. I'd like her back to be a little more flat, but really pushing with minimal weight bearing. We'll talk about that again in a second. Oh, why does that keep doing that? Sorry. So he's walking. You can find balancing. Here, being on that ball versus a barrel or a mat changes the amount of core implications for it. And you can hold a bar, you could push against a wall. It is hard to push and balance without any kind of gripping, but you can always challenge them to do that. Here, just on shaping, changing the diagonal, taking out some of the force, some of the weight bearing that's required for a handstand. So we're just focusing on the push and the shape. So gymnast wrist, we're not going to talk a ton about gymnast wrist specifically, but I do want to talk about it in terms of some of these drills. If you notice, most of them had minimal weight bearing. So it's a really good way to think about the handstand and other basics. You want to work smarter, not harder. Gymnast wrist typically occurs during periods of increased activity, and it's happening in such a large population of our gymnasts that we really need to address it widespread, not just for the kids who have the injury. So how can we can look at how we limit impact and weight bearing without reducing numbers. We don't necessarily want to do less, we just want to do less impact. We want to look at the force translation. Are they just kind of hitting a brick wall when their hands hit the floor or the horse, vault, table? Or are they absorbing and pushing? And then another thing is to look at stability up the chain. We can think about some of those shoulder stabilizing exercises we already talked about. So here's some video of working forced translation. Minimal weight bearing and impact on these, so it's a great way to work it without adding more round off back handsprings and more round off pushes and whatever other drill we're working on. You'll see a difference in that first one. I'll replay this. So in this first one, you can see there's some absorption, but then watch the difference as he comes all the way down the chain. It's not as smooth, so he doesn't have the stability to do it correctly, and that's a really big point that I'll focus with this gymnast in particular.
Shira,
Yeah.
sometimes you and Chris talk about going down the chain, and
Mm-hmm.
it took me a long time to understand. And you know, I have that knowledge. What do you mean going up and down the chain there?
Yeah, so, you know, I joke like the shoulder bones connected to the wrist bone or whatever that song is from childhood, it's all connected. So if I have a problem at the wrist, it might not actually be coming from the wrist. That's where we're seeing the problem. So actually we're about to talk about that in 1 second. So you want to look at all the variables. You can start from proximal, you can start from the end and move in, or you can start from in and move out. And some of the things we want to look at if we're talking about the wrist for an injury, evaluate what's going on at the wrist. But there's not so much change that we can do because it's one joint and it's just where the force comes in. So then what happens as we move up to the elbow and the shoulder? And the shoulder is a huge place to look for anything upper extremity injury. If we have a wrist or an elbow injury, we're probably looking up the chain to the shoulder and then even further to the core. And in the legs, it's the same thing. If we are working on the ankle, we're probably going to look at the hip and the knee and the quads and the hamstrings and the glutes in order to make changes there. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so these are just some fun games and ways to work the movement of energy, especially this last one. He's working like the movement from his back foot, through his front foot, through his arms. You can actually see the difference in this second gymnast. He's not quite getting it. So he did not take all of his weight from the back foot, through the front foot, up the core, out the shoulders, and out his arms. He's kind of just pushing the ball down. Versus, you see here, he almost falls over because he's pushing so much. Obviously, that's an exaggeration. We don't want him to fall over and be in that position on a hurdle, but it's the idea and letting them play and have another drill and work these in different ways so their brain starts thinking about that movement of energy through the system. So like we said, pain is not the problem. It's just alerting us that something is not functioning properly somewhere. It might not be exactly where the pain is. And as a coach, what can we do to help ease the transition of a gymnast from an injury? And how do we also use this information of an injury to address a potential problem in the rest of the group? So maybe we see a lack of forced translation when they're hitting in their round off back handspring, or when they hit the horse, it's just like a hard stop, like brick wall. Instead of absorption and repulsion, I like to talk about through the fingertips often. There could also be instability up the chain, like we just talked about, or in the core. And we might be able to trade out one pass or one station for a focus on these problem areas. So it's not saying the whole group has to stop tumbling because someone has wrist pain, but what can you do when you find that? You know, this group has now had 2 complaints, you know, someone has gymnast wrists and the next kid complains of wrist pain. What are you going to do? And so incorporating some of these things, especially thinking about how to get them off of their hands and off of weight bearing while we're still working those same overall goals of the skill. So by finding these weak spots and purposefully training them, we can assist athletes in coming back from injury as well as in the prevention process. So this study was on the return to play of soccer players after muscle strain, so in the hamstring, groin, and quad. And it found that there was a re-injury rate of 2 to 9% for up to 15 weeks after return to play. And this is really important as a coach to understand, because when they are returning to play, they're often being released from PT around the same time. And depending on where they go and their insurance and all these other factors that have nothing to do with their ability to perform their gymnastics skills, they might be discharged from physical therapy and they're coming back to you and saying, okay, I'm cleared. What do we do? So we don't have all of the information like as a PT would, but we can help in trying to focus on these movements rather than skills. So a lot of times you think in a return to sport, okay, they're coming back, we'll only do 5 is a general rule we give. But are you really getting a lot out of having them do 5 round off back handsprings? Or could you focus more on taking them out of that weight bearing and picking all those different pieces of the round off, the entry, the push, the rounded shape, and targeting each one of those specifically so that those movement patterns are reinforced in their brain. And then when they do come back and as they continue, they will now have changed whatever the issue was before. All right, this one's just for you, Dan. Shoulder extension is definitely not as big of a problem in women's gymnastics, so thank you for pointing it out. I just wanted to show a couple of my favorite exercises. He has a lot of trouble on this one. This gymnast has really limited shoulder and thoracic range of motion, as well as a weak core, and you can see it in the way he does these skills, but we're able to make really awesome progress with some of these just the first time he did them. And you'll notice in the first video, he's holding a weighted ball. So instead of just doing we call it a CAR, it's an articular motion. We're trying to get all the range of the shoulder, reaching all the way down, forward, up, and out. We have the hand coming up and then it turns. And by holding the ball, we're giving just a little more feedback and making it more applicable, like when you're holding onto the bar or tumbling. So now that we've looked at ways to methodically evaluate movement, how else can we be purposeful in our decision making? And that comes down to motor learning and what's involved. So in motor learning, we're taking in new information and we begin to practice it. You know, you watch a video or you see someone perform a skill, and then we have the first few drills that we're starting. So we have a neural network for one piece of information and a neural network for another piece of information. And now we're trying to connect the two. So we're slowly like bushwhacking, making a little path from one to the other. And as we sleep, this information is consolidated into our long-term memory. So when we're sleeping, we're replaying what happened, all the things we learned, all the things from our sensory and motor inputs that happened. And as we replay them, we're building those networks. We're improving the ability to get through that path. And so then now we have a long-term memory of how to do this skill, but it goes even one step further than that. So as we continue practicing, we get new information. Maybe a coach tells us something in a different phrase, or we try a new drill and it clicks. So that new information needs to be adapted into what we already know. And that process is called destabilizing. We're taking some of the information and throwing it out. And then we're restabilizing by inputting this new information. And when we sleep, we consolidate it and turn it into long-term memory. So when we're teaching a round off back handspring, we break down every single piece of the round off and the back handspring. But when we go to teach a Yurchenko, we don't need to start at the beginning. We don't have to teach a hurdle. We don't have to teach the hand placement. It's generally the same. So that's this neural network of a round off back handspring. Now we also have the network for vaulting, how to run down the runway, what the vault is, what it feels like, all of those things. And we're trying to make that pathway between so that we can do a Yurchenko. So we break the information specific to round off back handspring on the floor, and we add the changes for uphill. Where are our arms? Where are we standing? Each coach has slightly different decisions and choices for this, and I've seen any number of where exactly you want your arms and the position on the board. We can debate that all day, but the overarching idea is that you have to help these learners learn that new pattern. So you need to be really specific in what they already know and what is changing so that they can restabilize that information into long-term memory. So implicit and explicit knowledge are really important for a gymnast. Explicit knowledge is the ability to articulate it or communicate what you know. And implicit is what's not directly taught. So someone who can watch and then make their body do it, but they can't really tell you what's happening. As coaches, we have to explicitly know what's happening in order to inform our gymnasts how to do it. And then we sometimes see naturally talented kids fall into this implicit learning. They just kind of do a skill and they're successful, but they don't really know how they did it. And this lack of explicit knowledge can have major implications on fear because we have to know the information in order to feel confident that we can successfully complete it each time. So we have different stages of learning. I'll talk about two different ways to classify it. In this first one, we have a cognitive learner. In this stage, they're gathering information. We see large gains and improvements, but inconsistent performance. This is a time to let them trial and error so that they can make a map of what they're doing and what's expected. In the associative phase, they're putting actions together. We see some smaller gains, some smaller changes, and still a disjointed performance and a very conscious effort. So they have to think about each thing that they're doing. This is a great stage for all kinds of practice and feedback models that we're going to discuss next. In the autonomous stage, it's happening after a lot of time and practice. So performance seems unconscious or almost automatic. They have really smooth movements. And it's our job to keep this automaticity fresh. So just because it's automatic does not mean that it's right. We have to always go back and practice the basics, break down the skills we've already learned. We know this as coaches, but this is why. Another way to look at it is the 4 stages of competency. And when we start, we aren't sure what we don't know. Then we gain information on what's required, but we're unable to complete it yet. Then we move into the phase where we can perform a skill accurately and independently, but it still requires a high level of concentration. And then we move into the phase where the skill is automatic. This automatic time is a great opportunity to have the learners become teachers in order to keep the information fresh. So especially, I know Dan, we talked about, you have a range of levels. So allowing those optionals and those higher level gymnasts to take something that for them is now a foundational movement, is easy, is automatic, and teach it. It refreshes that explicit knowledge of the skill and makes sure that their mental map and their patterning stays fresh and sharp. So a lot of research on learning focuses on learning and practicing one specific skill at a time, but in gymnastics, we need to practice and learn many things concurrently. So planning our workouts based on the stage of learning and our goals for that point in the season can help with efficiency based on the acquisition or the retention of the motor skill. In general, it's found that blocked practice, so training all of one skill or action at a time, has improved benefits for acquiring a skill, whereas random practice is better for retention and consistency. So serial practice can be thought of as something in between the two. This is like our skill set. So we don't have the predictability of blocked. We're not doing the same skill over and over and over, but we don't have the randomness of totally random. So we don't have repetition, but we have a little bit more of an order. We use this all the time. And it's important to understand that serial in studies acts most like random. So it's good for that retention and consistency. And one study showed that serial practice schedule impairs motor skill consolidation through a conflict in the brain networks. So the cognitive representation of the skill, the mental map that's happening of the sequence and its execution is getting confused when we're mixing the practice of different tasks. So if we don't have a skill yet, and let's say we're working giants on bars, if those are really new to someone and we have one bar is free hips and the next bar is working on, or the next thing is the back extension roll down a wedge, and we have all these different things. While yes, the free hip and the giant are similar, the brain can get confused in those mental maps. And so it's found that blocked practice when you're learning a new skill is the best way to do it. So we all use demonstrators of different skills, and research has shown that using both a learning model and a correct model are really effective. And I think it just comes down to making a choice in the moment. So the learning model is someone who's also learning it. You take a kid who doesn't know the skill and you're putting them through it to show others. This is great because it allows the observer to see the performance, hear the feedback, and also they're processing the model's attempt to improve their performance. And that has a lot of benefit on neuroplasticity and learning. A correct model obviously gives the proper representation of the skill, and so has its own benefits. And then when it comes to visualization, we know that it's important, but why and how do we use it to be most effective and efficient? So there's similar activation of the cortical and subcortical motor systems of the brain when we're practicing and when we use imagery. Now, what does that mean? So we can use this when we're learning a new skill. We demonstrate using a correct model and then have them visualize it. Now they've seen what it should look like. They can go close their eyes and use imagery to create action within their brain of thinking about this skill. We can also use it during the unconscious competence phase, or that automatic phase, for routine consistency. We want them to focus on the details to avoid that automaticity. One study found that performing somatosensory training before observation can prime the sensory motor system and enhance observational learning. So adding a drill to prep the body for what they see actually had more effect when using observation. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we go over the sensory system. And another study about observation looked at learning consecutive tasks. So learning two different things, learning, let's say, a circling skill and a giant at the same time. And so the application of this, if we're in season and we're doing complexes focusing on one specific skill, whether it's a release move or the flipping of a vault or twisting, we're doing all of our drills focusing on that specific skill that's still new in their routine, but we don't want to forget about progressing and what's next. We always want to have that involved and as part of our workout, but how do we do that without confusing the brain? So what we want to do is use our rest station, maybe it's our mask break station at this point, but use our rest station as an observational station. So they're working drills for skills in the routine, and then when they rest, they're watching a video or another athlete do a skill that they don't currently have. And this allows us to make that mental map without confusing the brain on what we're doing in our motor skills. We all know that our words matter. It's coming up all the time in so many different factors, but they really do. If we want the gymnast to make corrections, they need feedback to adjust their performance toward the goal. This feedback can also be used as motivation. When an athlete does a skill and the coach corrects them, they're getting intrinsic and extrinsic feedback, or at least they should be. So unfortunately, I often see a gymnast who's unable to bring their attention internally. They can't really feel what's going on. So they depend completely on their coaches to tell them what to do. I'm sure you've all had that athlete where every time they take a turn, they look to you. And if you ask them any questions, they're unable to process what their body did and what they felt. So the better we can help the gymnast understand their internal environment, the more independent they're going to become with working a skill or a side station, and the more effective we can be in adding drills to our workout. So if you have mirrors or you can use videos, it can be really helpful so that this gymnast or gymnast in general can connect what they did and what they felt with seeing their performance. Here's just some examples. So this gymnast is definitely hypermobile, and the small weight that he has in his hand is easily stacked. But if you misjudge how far to take it, you get that immediate feedback that he's in the wrong position. And you can see how quickly he's able to adapt and fix it. The first one, he goes way past. The second one, there's a small correction. And by the third one, he's able to find that. So that is intrinsic feedback. No one told him that he went too far, but the weight was able to tell him and help his body feel what was happening. And then this is just a fun mobility exercise I like to do. And it really shows the gymnast where they're limited. You can see he's holding something in his hand. I think it's a roll of tape, and trying to move around. So the action is you go out, around the head, and then you keep the palm up. You have something in your hand, and you want to go all the way out and back around without dropping it. And you can see that he really struggles in this last position. He has no control, and he flies right through it. So again, it's intrinsically telling him where he needs work. You can see he's controlled, 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 and then he kind of just flies right through the end. Giving feedback during a skill versus directly after it has different benefits. One is better for skill acquisition because they're getting the information while they're doing it. And the other one is better for complex skills, which is most of gymnastics, because they're able to actually think and apply it in their next turn. So we often find a gymnast explicit understanding is limited. They can't figure out what they need to change because they don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing at each step. So our verbal cues should always aim to assist in this explicit knowledge whenever possible. We can do this by asking why or how over and over and over. So if they know that they fell, you can say, why? My arms were slow. Why? I didn't push off the floor in my back handspring. So now the new cue while they're doing the skill would be push, because they've gotten the correction, they've thought about it, and they can apply it. Now you're just reminding them in real time. We can also look at the knowledge of performance. So maybe they're flipping and they can tell you my rotation was slow. Why? Your core wasn't engaged, so your hips didn't lift. So the new cue would be lift or core. Knowledge of results and knowledge of performance are really important to think about when we're giving cues in terms of what our goal is and where in the season we are. So one tells us about the end result and the other tells us about what we did, which caused the result. So knowledge of results is good for working on consistency, whereas knowledge of performance is better for learning a new skill. We have to explicitly know all of the performance goals in order to evaluate and give feedback. We want to do our best to keep these positive and motivating. So giving them feedback on what they can do versus what they didn't do is just one way to think about how our words matter. So instead of saying your arms were bent, you can simply change it to your elbows didn't extend to grab the bar. It's not just about giving positively phrased feedback, but also what specifically are you focusing on? You can give feedback on what they're doing correctly, and this brings attention to that specific aspect, and it continues that performance, as well as increasing motivation for continuing to try a skill. We want to open up opportunities for failure without negative connotation. So a gymnast seeing that they can fall and still get positive feedback about correct aspects of what they did is very motivating when learning a new skill. You can also give feedback on what they need to do differently. So it's definitely assisting in our explicit understanding of the skill. Talking about the mistake and what they didn't do can be more effective when working on learning a new skill. In season and working routines might be more helpful to encourage them with notation of what they excelled at. So just some other areas to consider, the next steps of where we're looking. The sensory system, we know most of it, but what are those two at the bottom? We'll go over it. Sensory motor integration is really important. We have input coming into our brains from all of our senses. It travels through the spinal cord to the brain. It's processed there, and then the motor output information is sent back down the spinal cord to the appropriate areas needed to create the movement. So this involvement of sensory and motor, a lot of times we think of skills in gymnastics as motor, gross motor, functioning, movement, but really what we're getting from our sensory system is deciding how and what we do with that movement. So the vestibular system, if you don't know, we can all somewhat grasp like the typical senses of sight and sound, but the vestibular system is our perception of our head position. And it does this in a really cool way. So if you think of like really tall grass, you have this big field of grass and a therapy ball, you know, those big balls that you lay on, and you're gonna push it and it rolls and it bends the grass. So just keep that in mind. Because inside of our ear canals is very similar to this. So we have these finger-like cilia and a crystallized ball. So as I move my head, I have different angles of these different canals in my ear. And when I move my head, this ball is pushed and tips over the cilia. So the information about the displacement of these little hair-like cells is sent to our brain, and it tells us about our changes in rotation, direction, and speed. Because if I go this way, the hair bends that way, so my brain knows that my head went that way. This plays a major role in balance, and it can be a factor to consider when a skill isn't quite figured out and you don't really know why the gymnast is struggling. Think about their head position and their understanding of where their head is. So proprioception is our understanding of where our body is in space. It's positional and movement awareness. So this is the way that we know where our body is and what it's doing. It assists in planning, positioning, and graded movements. Think about that plank snatch video where he didn't know exactly where he was, and he was able to quickly adapt based on the information his body was given. So we're getting constant signals to the brain based on the receptors in our muscles and joints. You can think of this if you put a finger out in front of you, close your eyes, and then you want to tap back and forth between your nose and your finger with your eyes closed. It might not be smooth right away, but you quickly are much more targeted and efficient, and that is learning. So proprioception can be practiced, and we should. So earlier we talked about that somatosensory priming for observation, and this could be a great exercise. It's working on proprioceptive discrimination. So he's not just thinking about the strength and the shaping, but I'm giving him cues for an imaginary clock. So 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 9:30, whatever it is. And we can use this on its own or before observation of a video. Maybe we're talking about, and we want him to focus on where he releases, where his feet are when he releases for certain release moves, or a dismount, or where his feet go when he's doing a giant. And so this is proprioceptive discrimination. The proprioceptive training programs are really effective in reducing the incident rate of ankle sprains in an athletic population. So not just those who have had ankle sprains should be doing these stability, balance, proprioceptive training, but everybody should be, because it's really important and it works. Another area to consider when learning and refining a skill is our body's ability to produce purposeful, coordinated movements and its interaction with the rest of the body and the environment. So providing appropriate output and instruction to control the tasks we're asking it to do. Something to think about is that pain will always alter the movement pattern and control. So if someone is having pain, how do we alter their workout to minimize these changes? We don't want to strengthen the neural pathways for incorrect movement. So we need to find something that they can do correctly with minimal pain and practice that. So this study looked at two groups and they were split into training programs that focus on internal focus. So, where are your knees, or don't put your knees over your feet, sit your butt back. Those are all internal focuses versus an external focus of land on this point or lift your arms or reach for something, look for something. Those are external focuses. So they were split into two different training groups with these two different cues. Both training programs reduced landing forces. So working anything is better than nothing, is what this tells us. But even more, the externally focused group promoted better adaptations that could be implemented. So if we're always giving internal cues, then we're not really helping our gymnasts to translate this information during a skill and routine. Like if we think about a double back, it requires a lot of attention and cognitive tasks that have nothing to do with our landing. So of course, we do these landing drills because we want them to land their double back and be safe. But when we actually do the double back, we're not thinking about, okay, knees over feet, hips back, chest up. We're thinking about the run and the round off back handspring and the rest of our routine and who's over there watching and all these other cognitive tasks. So we need to train with an external focus, not just expect it in practice. Another study on balance learning found the same thing. There was a positive benefit in performance during acquisition, retention, and transfer of the information. So again, cueing externally is really appropriate. We do this when they're younger. We always say squash the bug or reach for the ceiling, look for the picture on the wall. And then sometimes when we move into the team, I know that I find myself trying to correct the gymnast without giving them those external focuses, which studies show will make it more applicable and more efficient. So if we take some of these ideas and look at the Tkachev, in case this didn't work, I took a picture. This is a really new learner. Also, he, as I said earlier, has limited overhead mobility and trunk rotation, as well as a weak core. This skill clearly has a long way to go because of those factors, and I kind of stopped at this point where I see it. You can see a lot of those limitations. We want to look at the physical needs, where in the learning process he is, and what our goal is based on when we want this skill to happen. So the action needed would be the throw, the heel drive, the sit up. Some movements involved in that are the kick back, the throw, the opening of the shoulders. So where do we go first? We need, I showed you already some. Here's another one of my favorite thoracic spine, shoulder mobility exercises. You can go backwards and forwards. He did the wrong arm, but you keep the same arm. And this one, I was just trying to challenge his core in any way I could. So in a Tkachev, you are in an open shape and you have to activate your core. So training him in a hollow body, while it's strengthening those muscles, it's not strengthening the action. So now I put him in an open position and I asked him if he could engage his core, and he struggled. But it's somewhere to go. I'd like his arms up eventually. There. So then we can move into the movement. And so the movement would be arch and throw. Arch is a foundational movement. Throw is a foundational movement. But now we're doing it chest opening behind us. We can do lots of different blocked practice of this opening. So I might have a million different drills all in a row working on just that open. the open position. And even after he gets to that open, I'm going to train it even further. I want him to open as he sits up and work on his chest. So we're targeting the action after we've targeted specifically the shoulders and the core. Now, as we get a little further in the blocked practice, we can move through the entire skill. So maybe we have 5 different stations all working on Tkachev. This is a great place to add in something called bandwidth feedback, which is where we're giving feedback only on large errors. So if we see, once he's a little further, he's doing the tumble track Tkachev drill, most of the time within a range that we feel is acceptable of correct. When he does it within that predetermined band of correctness, we don't give him any input, or maybe a simple yes for completion. And then only when he's outside of that band of correctness do we give more specific details and corrections. So this is a way to start fading our cues and allowing the gymnast to become more independent. Am I out of time? I am. That's okay. Another idea is when we look at the double back, we have it mastered, but now it's the second pass. We might see that they're breathing, their legs buckle, their arm lift is slow. We could see any number of things happening. And so we want to target it specifically based on their cardiovascular, muscle, attention, whatever it is we're seeing.
Shira, we have plenty of time. The next lecture is at 1 o'clock, so don't rush.
Oh,
Finish up. Dude,
this is the end, but I'll just go back to this slide. So if we want to target it specifically, I know that we all add cardio. You know, we do a floor routine and we jump rope or whatever other cardio we have in our workout. But if this specific problem is happening, maybe look at why. So why can they not make it in the second pass? Is it just their cardiovascular endurance? Is it their muscle endurance? What did we see? Was there a lack of arm lift? Was there round off back handspring slower? How do we train it specifically? So I love mat pushes because it works cardiovascular and muscle endurance. So some different ways we could do it is adding mat pushes with a back tuck. Maybe that if the round off back handspring or the set was the problem, we do mat pushes with round off to layout, or mat pushes with a double back into the pit, where we're taking a lot of the stress off of the joints in the landing, and we're just focusing on pushing their cardio before doing the skill. So we can get creative. And also we want to look back at our lower extremity strength endurance programming in general and consider how we can adjust it if this is a problem, especially for more than one kid. So if we increase strength and stability, etc., during our preseason, remember that we can go down to some of those exercises 1 time a week and maintain the same gains that we saw originally. So I don't know if anyone wants to pick a skill to try and look at this. I know we broke down a really basic handstand and then we went to the Tkachev, so there's obviously lots in the middle, but we can really do this with any skill and drill. We want to think about the 5 factors. So what's the goal? What are the actions needed? What foundational movements are involved in that? Where do we have to go when we're looking at a local area? And then assess the movement. Put it into different pieces and assess it, and those assessments can become skills. If we go all the way back to some of those different ways to change movement, we have the driver. So are your arms moving? Is your foot moving? Where are you going? What direction? How do we change the surface we're on to make it harder or easier? There are so many different variables we can use to change and adjust, adapt, progress our exercises. And this helps us be more individualized. So if we have a general lunge, maybe one group is more focused on the proper technique of it, and you're giving them a cue of step on this dot so that they're taking a large step. Maybe the next group is trying to improve their stability. They've had a lot of ankle rolls. You really want to go back to that, even though we're in season, and you put them on an unstable surface, and you're now challenging their proprioception and their balance. Or you can add a band in all different directions to target their core. There's so many different ways to change one same exercise that we can really individualize what we're doing. This is just a summary. Go back, look at mobility, stability, strength. That's really where I always go first. And once you're there, you can integrate that into your actions and to help be efficient. Oops. That is all I've got for you. Does anyone have any questions? I can't hear you, Dan.
Let me stop the screen share, and then we'll
Yeah.
excellent, excellent. All right, so let me open it up to any questions. Chris, Matt, Jen, anybody else have any questions for Shira? If you do, just give a wave. Go for it, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for that, Shira. That was great. I I'm generally familiar with most of the internal external cueing research, and I know I'm not familiar. I don't think any has been really looked at acrobatic stuff, so like inversion or some non-upright standing posture kind of stuff. And so most of it is like maximal force, maximal effort in some capacity. There's less stuff on precision, a little bit of balance stuff. But I'm curious if in sort of acrobatic stuff, when we are upside down and we have this imprecise sense of where external objects are in external directions, if external cueing is still appropriate, or would you divert to internal cueing in that sense, either based on research or personal experience?
Yeah, I think they're both really important. And my biggest thing as a coach is I'm trying to train their internal sense. So I give a lot of cues about their actual body positioning, not just external cues, because gymnastics is so specific. So a lot of the research, you're right, it's on like a squat or a lunge or something that is so different than what we actually do in gymnastics. So I do a combination of both. I think that when I'm talking about cueing externally, it's like a final step or a starting step, kind of one or the other. So, you're telling someone they're doing bounce bar first time handstands or giant drill. You're telling them you want to stretch your feet as long as possible before you pike or whatever it is. Instead of saying that, you could just say feet to the wall, feet to the ceiling. And that maybe helps them think of it more as a whole and what the scheme of it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm working with younger athletes, I use a lot of external cueing because they don't have that internal sense. So I use the external cueing to get what I want, and then I kind of stop them in that position and explain what's happening and ask them to squeeze and move and feel to help gain that internal sense so that they can have more internal. I really love drills and exercises that give them that automatic feedback. So like the plank snatch, if you have a weight in your hand, you can't mess it up, like without not knowing.
Right.
I do a lot of work on beam with the girls, and I'll take young kids, give them a small medicine ball over their head, and they have to do pivot turns. And if their arms move any bit, they're totally off the beam. So anything that can give those intrinsic cues on its own are some of my favorites. I know that there's like a vault blocking drill. You hit the board and then you go onto a donut. And so if you don't block off the board, you can't land on top of the donut. You pike and fall in the middle. Those kind of drills are really important in learning because it does both.
All right, cool. Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear that. I think just the internal versus external cueing discussion is just kind of, it's sort of inappropriately extrapolated to all situations where, I mean, from personal experience, I'm in line with you. The younger people, yeah, external stuff because they're simple and they can get it. But then, okay, yeah, there's certainly a place for internal cueing as well.
So yeah, if we think about like that high level athlete, once they understand how their body works, giving them that internal cueing of those specific details that they work so many years to understand is obviously going to be successful. But then what happens when they're in a routine and they change their tap because they're tired? We can give a cue of, well, for me, I give low bar or floor or whatever it is, and give that cue more in that automatic phase also can help them just think about those details.
Cool. Thank you.
One of the things that when I listen to both of you, it seems as though you have somewhat different directions that you come from. Chris is a very physics-driven, bottom-up. You start with the hands and you move all the way up to the shoulders, and it seems like Shira, you're like from a cognitive perspective, a top-down perspective, and it's like they both have merit. And one of the interesting things is that even though like conceptually they're completely different and you could argue for one or the other, not saying you're beholden to either one, but there's an evidence based knowledge that you both share. And Chris's, your evidence is based in physics and torque and Newtonian laws. In Shira, your evidence is clearly presented in research and the scientific method. And you said, Shira, evidence-based coaching, and I think that's something that Dave Tilley and that the rest of the presenters here, and that's one of the goals that I have for the regional congresses is to present evidence-based work. I applaud both of you. Those were both some really interesting, wonderful discussions there, and I really appreciate your contribution, Shira. That was really awesome.
I I like how you think of them as totally different, top down and bottom up in that sense, because I think you can also think of them as almost exactly the same. I mean, gymnastics is just physics. It's all physics. So in the way that Chris, you went from like hands to shoulders and moved up the chain or throughout the body, it's the same idea. You know, you want to look at where the problem is. And when you're starting something, you have to attack all of them because it's not necessarily a problem, it's just unlearned. So you have to teach each piece in succession, and then you can look at it as a whole skill.
Yeah, and if I could just comment on that, I mean, a lot of what you mentioned, it's interesting because like I think about a lot of what you mentioned, and I mean, you go to the research and you present it that way, but like all of that stuff, I think I've seen first as I've worked with people in handstands, and then I know the phenomenon, and then I go to the research and I'm like, okay, that's actually in the research, and that is exactly what I see in people. So it's nice to see that sort of in the trenches observations is very similar to what's in the research, but also like I was saying, to know when the research might be a little bit off from what we see as well.
I always found it really interesting as I was going through school. I've been coaching since I was in high school, and just seeing so many of these ideas that I talk about of different ways to group your practice and different ways to talk to a gymnast we're already doing as coaches, you know, like whether it's intuitively or learned from experience, they're already doing this, but I really loved breaking down the science and the research so I can be more directed and targeted in when I pick what for efficiency.
Yeah, right.
Awesome. That was awesome. Right? Great job. Um, I look forward to working with you guys again in the future, and I know that we can bring good messages and good coaching. And I mean, I feel like I learn every single day, and that's the blessing of being in education. And well done. Well done. Good job.
Thanks for having me, Dan.